Hello, I am David Sweeney, Communications Director at MIT Innovation Initiative. Today we are talking with Tim Miano. Tim is the Program Director at MIT Innovation Initiative. He's an innovation professional, an entrepreneur, mentor, instructor. He has a background in law and economics and the sciences, and his work focuses on designing and implementing innovation systems that allow for interdisciplinary solving of complex problems, with emphasis on human networks, large-scale projects, and leadership. Today, Tim's going to talk to us about innovation infrastructure, what it means to us at MITII, and how it supports and enables the entire innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem at MIT. Take it away, Tim.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Miano. I am the Program Director at the MIT Innovation Initiative. The presentation I'm going to give you today is about innovation infrastructure, enabling ideas to impact. So this talk will take part in 3 parts. First, I'll do a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll go through 3 different sections. So the first question is, why build innovation infrastructure? And the answer is because innovation infrastructure is the how of innovation. It is the mechanisms you lay down to enable problem solving in a systematic way. Innovation infrastructure enables people to solve problems at a very fundamental level. And so this is an idea that I'm going to keep coming back to throughout this presentation. So the goals of this talk are threefold. One, it's to be interesting and entertaining. So please enjoy yourself. We're going to talk about innovation infrastructure. We're going to talk about games. If this was live, we would play games together. And we're going to think about how to make innovation interesting for others. The second is the goal here is to be practical. So I'm going to provide some models for thinking about how this applies to your company or your startup or your university. But hopefully it's something that you can actually take away and put into practice. And third, my goal is to give you some insight into MIT's future innovation infrastructure, lateral best practices from our university context, and maybe give you a little bit of insight into how we think about these things at MIT. So I mentioned we're going to play some games. Well, why games? Why would I talk about that? And the answer is that games are a useful lens for thinking about innovation infrastructure. Games are microcosms of cooperative human behavior. Playing games means having fun and solving problems at a really fundamental level. And games are a useful mechanism for open and creative leadership. So innovation infrastructure. So part 1, I'm going to tell 3 stories and talk about 3 different games. Innovation infrastructure in 3 stories. Part 2, I'm going to go over a bunch of useful models and thinking about innovation infrastructure. And in part 3, we're going to go through those next generation examples. So part 1. And the first story is going to be a story of physical assets. And it's from the past. Ready? So I'm going to flash there's 2 sets of pictures on the screen. You remember back in pre-COVID days, we would go to these places called bars and we would order a drink and there would be a little screen on the bar and you could flash 2 pictures and there would be a difference between the 2 pictures. And then you could point and click and see if you could spot the differences. So that's what this game is. So I'm going to flash 2 sets of pictures, one from the 1870s and one from the 1880s. And they're in New York City. And see if you can spot what thing happened in that 10-year time period. Ready?
Yep.
Did you get it? Any guesses?
That was fast. I don't know.
Well, so in the 1870s, New York looked like this. And over the course of about 10 or 15 years, telephone wires started crisscrossing the entire city. And then in 1888, there was a massive blizzard across the entire Northeast. So bad was this blizzard that it brought down telephone wires all across Manhattan. It buried houses in Brooklyn up to 50 feet tall, and it blanketed so much of the Northeast that it caused entire cities to change their infrastructure plans. All these telephone wires got buried underground, and in Boston, it spurred the building of the Boston subway system. So that was a story of physical assets. Let me tell you a story of cultural assets, and this story is from the present. And in fact, it's about the MIT Innovation Initiative, the team I work with. So at MITII, our mission is to be the stewards of MIT's innovation ecosystem. We build and enable innovation infrastructure, and we enable ideas to impact. And this is our team. And when COVID hit, we all went remote. And so we had lost a lot of the team interactions that we had been able to cultivate when we were in person. So what did we do? We immediately started doing staff games once a week using various forms, really simple stuff. In this case, just a creative expression. So you'd write a code name and you could upload your creative expression, whether it was a painting or a drawing or a poem or anything you had done. And then the rest of the team got to see it, and you had to guess who on the team had made that thing. Well, this is a very sort of like subtle, minor thing, but sort of gamifying these opportunities for people to get to know each other, these sorts of relationships, really has a powerful impact on building team unity and cohesiveness, and it really makes people understand each other better. And it ended up being this huge thing that helped us transition from being in person to being remote in our sort of new COVID life. And we've had a couple of these things in addition to your creative expression. We've gotten to share leadership war stories where people told stories of good leaders they'd experienced and bad leaders experienced, and even some really fun ones, including what was your 3 a.m. drunken gas station convenience store purchase? And if you notice, somebody at the bottom even went so far as to Photoshop all of those different items into a paper bag for the rest of our amusement. And besides creating a positive, sort of fun atmosphere amongst all the staff, this exercise also helped our team learn a bunch of new software tools. So these games we played using Airtable, which is a database software. And we also play games using Miro, which is a whiteboarding software. So prior to COVID, none of us had used really these tools in depth. But once we all transitioned and we needed a new set of tools in order to learn how to use those tools, we just implemented them into our games and made it so that there was a very sort of low risk, low barrier to having people be able to play with these things as opposed to just having to learn them.
Tim, I'm going to interrupt for a second and let you know that I really feel like at a time when we were all kind of thrown out there and put in positions that did not match our everyday, these things really did build structure around a very kind of amorphous space. We got to know each other a lot better through the games, but also the new tools helped us function and do work in a way that we hadn't thought about before. It really did provide the structure that I think we all needed.
Awesome. Thanks, David. So now let me tell you one more story, and this is a story of the future. So at MITII, we run a thing called the Corporate Innovation Program, and this is an opportunity for a small cohort of corporations that want to build their innovation capacity and their innovation infrastructure to come to MIT and learn those skills and learn what we have learned over the last 20 years about how to do innovation and deploy those learnings into their own companies. And we do this through a series of modules. One of the modules is a funding board. So a funding board is sort of an expert panel where the company defines a specific challenge. And if the company judges value in the proposed solutions from their employees, they can select, award, and fund the further development. So what's the game aspect here? Well, for me, that sounds an awful lot like Shark Tank, right? What you've got is a mechanism where within a company, you've got people that want to pitch ideas. You've got some expert board that they want to come and decide what's a winning idea, what's not a winning idea. The company is literally deploying assets and funds to make this thing happen. And it sounds like a lot of fun. I mean, I happen to love the idea of just sitting around and having people pitch really good ideas to me and then getting to throw money at them and kick back and see what happens. That sounds like a lot of fun. Now, for most corporations, it's probably not a great idea to start with this model. Um, but believe it or not, even at MIT, we have very similar models. We have the 100K competition where students get up, they spend an entire year through a series of um, increasingly difficult challenges until they get to the final culmination at the end of the year where 10 to 15 teams get on stage and they pitch to a panel of judges and they can be awarded $100,000. And some of these companies have gone on to do really fantastic things. So here at MIT, we actually have many, many examples of these type of economic innovation infrastructure assets. So we have a lot of different pitch competitions and concept competitions and prizes and hackathons and all sorts of ways for people to participate in what are essentially innovation games and then get rewarded for participating in those innovation games. So there's an entire ecosystem of different mechanisms for doing this. So one of the things we like to help companies think about that come to MIT is how would you think about your funding boards and what ways would you think of developing it? But at the fundamental level, the point here is that this is all about economic innovation infrastructure, building these economic assets. Okay, so let me just summarize real quick. Why did I tell these three stories? I told a story about physical innovation infrastructure assets, power lines in the 1880s, and think about how new that was, and think about how that massively changed the physical landscape of New York City in just a really short amount of time. And then what happened? Some sort of act of nature came through and drastically changed how everybody did business. And people had to respond to that and they had to innovate and evolve in real time. I told you a story about cultural infrastructure assets, how my team, we think about using games to transition from non-COVID life to COVID life, how we use those games to learn new pieces of software. And then how there are also these economic innovation infrastructure assets. These are games where people can play with a safety net. They can learn to escalate how sophisticated their ideas are through a series of gated steps and receive some prize money in the process. Okay, so that thing in the middle, this Venn diagram, where does it overlap? And these are all different types of innovation assets. And it's worth saying that physical and cultural and economic, these are not the only ones. There's many. And part of the goal of this talk is to tell you more about those. But I wanted to at least start off with being able to anchor you to those three different types. Okay, so we're going to think about for the rest of this conversation, how do we analyze, design, and build new models within those asset classes? Okay, good. Part two. So part two, I'm going to create sort of a model for thinking about innovation infrastructure. And it's important to say why models? Well, models are a lot like games. They help us isolate ideas and reduce complexity. Now, models are not necessarily a reflection of all of the complexity of the real world. They're intended to be simplified versions of the real world that help us understand. So there's definitely different ways to push and pull on a model, but as long as it helps you understand, then it's a good model. So let me start off very broadly and say, okay, let's think about innovation as this black box. And here at MIT, we define innovation as the process of translating ideas to impact. So you're sitting at home, you think, I have a great idea for something. And we think, okay, well, what are the 30 or 40 or 50 steps between you having that great idea and that great idea actually existing in the real world and having a positive impact on people? So how do we unpack this black box? Well, so the one way to think about innovation infrastructure is sort of unfolding that black box and starting to break it down into a bunch of different constituent pieces. Some of those might be about resources. Some of those might be about stakeholders. Some of those might be about industry, different verticals or horizontals. And then once we have broken that apart into its different constituent parts, we can think about how ideas and people flow through all of those different things. And then we can fold it back up, and then we have a pretty interesting model that actually helps us teach other people how to walk through all of those steps to take their ideas to impact. Furthermore, we can think about what things are missing or what things need to be strengthened to help propel people along the path at various stages. Okay, so let's then think about what does MIT's innovation black box look like? So we can decompose MIT's innovation black box into a way that's useful in thinking at, let's say, a corporation, for example. But this could also be at another university, or this could also be in government, or this could also be in a venture capital setting. I'm just going to use a corporation as an example to help make it a little more concrete. Okay. So as I said, right, in the sort of larger innovation ecosystem stakeholder model, there's all these different players. I'm going to focus on here the potential translation of ideas from universities to corporations as opposed to the other three. But the other three could be equally as valid. And I'll say one more thing as well, that there are differences between universities and corporate innovation ecosystems. So one question is, how useful is the university context in translating ideas to the corporate context, right? One of these things is a nonprofit organization. One of these things is a for-profit corporate organization. So I just kind of want to give you this idea of fractals. So fractals are mathematical objects that exhibit self-similar patterns at increasingly small scales. So self-similarity means that the whole has the same shape as more or one or more of the internal parts. So why am I showing you that? Well, because as you think about dissecting the university context, what we're going to see as we peek into that black box is a bunch of patterns start to emerge. And what matters is not necessarily the shape of the things. What matters is not that universities and corporations are for-profit and not for-profit. What matters is that the ways of thinking about innovation and the interventions to empowering others to act innovatively, those become rule sets that are shareable across universities and corporations as we break these things down into smaller and smaller constituent parts. So that's the self-similarity across universities and corporations that I want you to take home. Okay, so back to MIT's innovation black box. So we know that impact comes out of MIT. We know that all of these patents and all of these startups and all sorts of things that have a positive impact on the world pop out of the end. We also know that somehow within MIT, ideas are getting generated. So the question is, what does that look like in this context? Well, at MIT, we divide the world into three things. There's research and education, and these two things give rise to very novel ideas. Sometimes we think about dividing the world into dorm-based startups and lab-based startups, those with IP and those that are coming out of student dorms. Now, those ideas then need to enter the third pillar of MIT, which is the innovation pipeline. So the way we think about this is that these ideas, they're coming out of the labs and from the students, and we need to build this innovation pipeline to help translate these things into impact. So let's dissect that even further. What does MIT's innovation pipeline look like? Well, it's worth noting that this kind of now starts to look a little bit like a process model. So we've got input, we've got an output, and we've got some sort of process in between, which is a lot like a mathematical function, right? A function is something that takes elements from one domain, it does something to them, it changes them in some way, and then it outputs this other thing in codomain Y. So the question is, can we build a model of a function that describes innovation at MIT or at a corporation or in society as a whole? Um, so we can think, okay, well then the problem we're trying to solve is, what is the innovation function? What does that look like? Okay, so let's apply this to our innovation pipeline at MIT. Well, it turns out that MIT has an extraordinary number of microeconomic interventions to help students and faculty and researchers take their ideas through the pipeline. There's more than 74 different programs, there's more than 48 different groups, and there's more than 153 different courses. So again, these are kind of the microeconomic interactions where an individual student or a faculty that's vibrating very quickly, they can go and utilize any one of these resources and help them along their way. But in addition to that, there are these layers of innovation infrastructure. So we can think about this as these programs that are this middle tube lining our innovation pipeline, and then these layers of innovation infrastructure that are wrapping the entire outside of the innovation pipeline that help everything in the middle. And these layers of innovation infrastructure are what I'm going to talk to you in more depth here now. So to understand these, we can take these, we can cut them open, we can lay them out flat. Now, I could give an entire talk on just this piece. For now, I'm going to skip that. If you'd like to see more about that, you can see that in another video. Just know that at MIT, we literally have hundreds of these things, and every single one of them helps us understand that pipeline from ideas to impact, from student to faculty, from no experience to lots of experience. And it's worth saying as well that places like MIT, we have the luxury of having very high volume, interactions with innovation activities. So a lot of companies, a lot of VCs, they really want to think about, how do I create unicorns? How do I just build things that are able to have the highest possible rate of return? And at a university context, at a place like MIT, we sort of think about these things as having volume metrics and impact metrics. So it's important. The reason I say this is that as you're thinking about innovation infrastructure and how we build innovation infrastructure, for the most part, it is the volume-based interventions that give rise to the impact-based interventions, but not the other direction. So it's really challenging to build things that are intended to produce unicorns without having all of the various shots on goal that allow for that entire set of possibilities. And these things, they create positive feedback loops whereby the act of creating structures that produce volume, number of students, number of ideas, number of ventures, is what allows for the higher impact things to then happen. Okay. So let's then think about this innovation infrastructure stuff. So we can cut this open and break this down into layers. So our goal then here is to decompose this innovation function into various components. And remember, back in part one, we thought about physical assets, cultural assets, and economic assets. Well, we can translate those ideas into all sorts of different layers at a university. So there's administration, there's community, there's data, there's education, there's funding, there's physical, there's policy. And there could be others. So this is the model that we think about at MITII as sort of stewards of the innovation ecosystem and as builders of innovation infrastructure. Anytime we dissect and try to understand what's going on in the ecosystem, we try to understand which layer that thing is or what type of layer it needs to be in for there to be interventions to make a positive impact. So let's make this a little more real, because that's not necessarily comprehensible in the abstract. So the best way to think about this is we can take these innovation infrastructure layers and think of them a lot like a GIS map layer. So if you think about a city or just a square mile of a city, right? You can understand that city, that square mile by isolating all sorts of different systems. You could think about the road systems. You could think about the electrical systems running through. You could think about the phone lines running through. You could think about where sunlight hits. You could think about where water flows when water falls onto the ground, right? So all of these different systems layers all compile onto that 1 square mile. But when you can break them apart and study them in isolation, it helps you understand very specific things that are going on that have to do with that system. So similarly, our innovation infrastructure layers are that thing. In reality, they are blended and they interact in the entire space at once. But by breaking them apart and thinking about them individually, we can start to understand how to create interventions and how to build things that help improve the innovation infrastructure, the innovation pipeline. All right. So some takeaways. Let's summarize that for a sec. So first, there are complex and overlapping layers of innovation that exist within your company, within your university, within your sort of venture capital networks, or within your startup. Two, in aggregate, these layers are part of an innovation ecosystem. And it's worth saying, right, though there's a common definition of the word ecosystem that we think about as these complex networks of interconnected systems like Silicon Valley entrepreneurial ecosystem. But it's worth thinking too that in many ways, these are actually biological systems. We are biological agents. Here, we're in the middle of COVID. We're in the middle of a biological crisis. We have to think about how our buildings and how our processes protect us from in this biological context. We have to think about sunlight and water and all these things. And all of the relationships we have with one another, these are all biological relationships. So the more we can understand innovation ecosystems as biological ecosystems, the better we understand how to improve the flow of ideas to impact through these systems. Finally, third, at the MIT Innovation Initiative, we build innovation infrastructure and then we steward that innovation ecosystem. So a very important thing within whatever innovation ecosystem you're in is ask yourself, is there somebody in that ecosystem, some person, some organization, some unit, some company, somebody whose job is to think about stewarding impact, whose job it is to build infrastructure that improves these things, irrespective of who benefits from it. Okay, so we can collapse this back down. And that's the innovation infrastructure function, and that's the innovation infrastructure model. Okay, so normally I would pause here and ask questions, but in this case, let me just plow ahead and we'll go on to part 3. So let me provide a bunch of really specific and concrete examples, right? Because that's just an abstract model at the moment.
Tim, can we go back for a second?
Sure.
Because I actually do have a question. I'm noting the time here. So when you talk about stewarding, if you go back a little bit, so a question I have is, with this ecosystem and thinking about it in these layers and in kind of a biological manner, to your point, there's a function of building and there's a function of stewarding, recognizing these layers and moving people and ideas through it. How does, on a top level basis, how would you describe our part in stewarding, not just understanding these levels and these systems and how they function together and with each other? How would you describe MITII's role in stewarding the process and ideas through those levels?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And to answer that, I can go back here. So keep in mind, I said that these I programs, right? Represents hundreds of other people that is not MIT Innovation Initiative. So these are the microeconomic interactions within the innovation ecosystem. These infrastructure layers support what all those other people are doing. So in our case, we say, what's everybody else doing and how can we build things that benefit all those other people that maybe they don't even see? It could be entirely invisible to them. But if we can increase their impact and their efficacy that by building some piece of infrastructure, then we have been successful because our mission is to be the stewards of the innovation ecosystem.
Gotcha.
So the truth is we are a very small part in terms of number of people that are helping develop these, all of this impact. But we have the unique role in that we are trying to think about it from a systems level and do things that simultaneously helps everybody, irrespective of the specific type of innovation they're trying to achieve.
Gotcha.
Okay. So let's go on to part 3, and we'll talk about some really specific examples of MIT's next generation innovation infrastructure. So we can look at our layers, and let's just isolate one of them. So there's the physical layer. And the reason we start with the physical layer, just like our examples of telephone wires, is that it's the easiest to understand. It's physical, it's tangible, it has references to the real world that people understand. So I am literally standing in MIT's new innovation headquarters. Here's a rendering of it. It was supposed to be open this summer, but due to COVID, that's been postponed for a few months. So this building was more than 10 years in the making. So let me give you some sort of details about how to think about it. So where is the innovation headquarters? So MIT is in the middle of this extraordinary innovation ecosystem that includes literally hundreds of companies. It's some Boston Consulting Group did an analysis and they call it the most innovative square mile on the planet. Some reports even say that 15% of all biotech companies in the world are located within 1 mile of where I'm standing.
Wow.
And then in thinking about how to create a new piece of innovation infrastructure in the midst of all of this, the question is, where does it go? Well, it was decided it would go right literally in the heart of that whole thing. In fact, it would go right on top of the metro stop where 1.5 million people every single day flow out of and will now start walking by this innovation headquarters. So it's intentionally proximate to as much foot traffic as possible. Moreover, it's co-located right in the heart of where both other major pieces of MIT's innovation infrastructure are, like the Martin Trust Center for Entrepreneurship and the MIT Media Lab, as well as across the street from major tech corporations and biotech corporations like Google, Boeing, IBM, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, et cetera. So this is another rendering of the building. Moreover, this building was designed to be the top 5 floors that sit on top of a first floor, and that first floor is the new Welcome Center for MIT. So going forward, every single prospective and incoming student and their families, every single prospective and incoming faculty will be greeted at MIT in this very first floor Welcome Center space. So this will see well more than 50,000 people a year on day 1 that it opens. And every single person that comes through here will be told, and upstairs is MIT's new innovation headquarters. So this signals to people from the get-go that innovation is at the heart of everything that MIT does. So, okay, so that's where. Let's talk about the who. So MIT Innovation Initiative, right? The way we think about the stakeholder network, the way we think about who do we serve, the way we think about who does this new physical facility serve, we think about all of these different stakeholders. First, we think about the student pipeline. We think about prospective students that are considering MIT or that have been accepted and are deciding where to go. The pre-frosh that have been accepted and maybe they're going to come to MIT for a few weeks, do some sort of bridge program before they start classes. Think about undergrads and grad students and student groups. So that's kind of the core. Then we've got the rest of the institute, all of the other departments, labs, and centers, the staff, the postdocs, the faculty, the researchers, all of these people, we have to ask ourselves, for each group, what do they need out of an innovation headquarters? And how is that different than what other groups need? We think about the greater MIT innovation ecosystem, all of the MIT affiliated ventures that graduate and then form companies, all of the alumni, all of the mentors that come and give back and serve to the community, the donors and the corporations and the partners that help make all this stuff possible. And we think about the curious public, the MIT parents that want to participate, and the public at large that is looking for thought leadership from MIT and how to do this stuff. But what's challenging about this is every single one of these stakeholders has a slightly different interest and wants to think about innovation in a slightly different way and might want resources out of the IHQ in a slightly different way. So we have to think about individually, what do each want, what do each need, and how can we build that? Right, so that's my complicated way of saying every single one of these groups is connected to the IHQ. Okay, well, so who else? Well, now we've got the people that are actually inside the innovation initiative. Inside of the innovation headquarters. So the mission of the innovation headquarters is to provide a home for MIT's innovation community, supporting those who pursue ideas with a passion for serious impact. So the design of this building intentionally said, okay, which groups at MIT are having very significant impact, and how can we co-locate them into one place so that this becomes a front door to MIT, a one-stop shop to understanding all of the different ways a person could get engaged, and then from there, move out into the rest of the campus and the rest of the ecosystem. So we included Sandbox, the innovation fund that provides money to students and grad students, Legatum, an international focused entrepreneurship organization, Dishbande, that's focused on helping laboratories translate intellectual property into real world impact, I-Core, an NSF program that helps teach scientists how to do customer discovery, Venture Mentor Service, an organization that mentors hundreds of students and alumni every single year, as well as MIT II. Okay, so that's the where and the who. Now we get to this really tricky, difficult question. What's the relationship between the who, the what, and the how? And the way we think about this is, how do you encode innovation into the physical infrastructure? If you understand what all those people want and need, and you understand all of the players that are in the space, how do you actually then start to deliver that? And the example I want to start with is Disney World. So in 1955, Disney World was built or started to be designed, and many of the people participating in the design of Disney World were themselves artists, right? Disney was an animation house. And in thinking about designing this, this park, they brought to bear their animation and drawing skill sets. So when you look down the street at Disney World, whether you realize it or not, your eye is being tricked in a number of interesting ways. So the buildings along this road are drawn in perspective. So what that means is that when you're standing right below a building, the floors that you see above you actually get smaller and smaller. And the reason that's done is because it makes the building look taller. It's whether you intend for it to or not. And then as you look down the street, it's creating these perspective lines that then make the street look long. And as a result, it makes the castle look taller at the end of the building. So I really like this example because it's a way of thinking about how to actually encode innovative ideas into the physical design itself. But let me give you a more modern example. And I know many of you might think modern examples would be like the Facebook campus or the Google campus or something like that. But I actually think a better example are casinos. Casinos are this really, really remarkable physical infrastructure because every single aspect of your physical experience at a casino has been optimized or is attempting to optimize for a very specific outcome. Now, in this case, it's gambling or gaming or taking your money or whatever, or helping you have fun. Um, but everything from the design of the carpets to the lighting to the smells and the sounds and where tables are located and what the line of sight to the exits or the bathrooms is to signage, it's all designed to try to optimize your interaction with the space. And we can ask ourselves, casinos have been evolving this expertise for more than 80 years. But if our goal instead of optimizing for gaming or entertainment, if our goal is to optimize for innovation, how would the physical architecture, how would the physical design of the space evolve to make it so that the space itself is contributing to your ability to think about problems and solve them? So that's how we try to think about the design of the innovation headquarters. We try to think about the macro level, who's using it, who are the individuals. We try to think about this meso level at a very individualistic level. What does a person need to be successful? Every single wall, every single object, we ask ourselves, what's the function of that object? And what needs to be there in order to empower people to make change? We think about the technology. What technology needs to be where, whether it's embedded in the walls or whether it's robots that are roaming around the classroom. And then we think about, just like electrical systems that are running all through the bones of the building, how can we use all sorts of things to make the building itself smart? Moreover, we think about, as you move through the building, what are the sorts of design gradients that move with you? So as you move up the building, are you moving from a loud to quiet gradient? As you move up the building, are you moving from a novice in venture creation and innovation to more mature? Is there a gradient of public to private space? Is there a gradient of volume, lots and lots of things going on to impact creation of unicorns? And how does the design of where those things are interact with all of the other pieces to make it so that the people actually using that space we're facilitating their ability to be successful? So this is at least our 1.0 attempt at taking the principles of casino design, optimizing for gaming, and bringing them to an innovation headquarters optimized for ideas to impact. And again, not surprising, then there needs to be very specialized pockets throughout the building that have other sorts of functions. So on the third floor, there needs to be a makerspace, but that makerspace has been intentionally located right next to the front door so that, in addition to providing tools to students to use to design and develop things, it actually becomes part of the visual experience, because then as you arrive to the innovation headquarters, you get to see all of this really interesting stuff going on. Similarly, different pockets of things are designed for high flex activities. Some places you want to make it so that students could literally turn the space into anything they want, just like a Star Trek holodeck or a Harry Potter room of requirement. And then finally, in an ideal world, we'd have the most high flex spaces available that could serve as meeting rooms or event spaces, and that could really truly be anything that it needs to be, not just for students, but for any type of event, whether it's a corporation or a president or a prime minister who's visiting MIT or anything in between. Okay, so that's an overview of the physical layer. And just like a GIS map, I mentioned that really these layers are interacting with each other and we're just isolated them to understand them. But it's worth noting that, right, we can then say, okay, well, let's take two layers and ask how those things are interacting with each other. So I go back to this 7th floor where we have this event space. So one of the plans we have to further extend the design of the space is to build a sensor grid where people that are studying innovation could then put out these sensors. And as hackathons and various kinds of innovation events are going on inside the space, there can be teams that are studying innovation in real time, and that can then give information back to those participating in innovation activities, feedback from what's actually going on. So this is the merger of a data layer and a physical layer that is interacting with each other to give people that want to be innovators even more tools in their toolkit to think about best practices. So another aspect of this data layer is that as people are flowing through the innovation headquarters, we are able to start understanding how people navigate MIT's innovation ecosystem. So you might start at the Martin Trust Center and take a class or a workshop there. Then you might go on to Sandbox, where you get $5,000 in free grant money to work on your startup. You might then move to Legatum Center and receive funding to go deploy this thing in Africa. And then you might go on to say Y Combinator. Well, it's important for us to have a data layer that can understand how people are flowing through the innovation ecosystem so that we can start to understand what are the best practices so that for the next generation, we can say, here's what people before you did, here's where we think the best way to move through the system is. And finally, one more example of the data layer is we have built and launched Wisdom, which is a women in innovation and STEM database at MIT. And the reason for this is it's a big problem that a lot of panels, a lot of conferences primarily have male speakers. At times, there might be a panel with only male speakers. So we thought, what can we do to make as low barrier possible so that somebody organizing an event can ensure that they have a diversity of voices on their panel or speaking at their conference. So we created this database, and women who are graduate students or postdocs or early stage faculty at MIT can sign up. They can add their profile to the system. It's searchable so that anybody who wants to put on an event, they can say, I need an expert in biomaterials that has startup experience, and they can search right away and find people to be on their panels of high quality. Okay, so let me give you one more example of how these layers interact with each other. And for that, I will talk about the development layer. So back here, I mentioned that MITII, the Innovation Initiative, is on the 6th floor. One of our programs is called the Proto Ventures Program. Now, I mentioned too that in order to have high impact programs, high impact interventions, things that are able to produce unicorns, you have to have the entire spectrum of volume. You have to have all of those hundreds and hundreds of shots on goal. Well, Proto Ventures is an example of a program that is designed to produce unicorns. We are able to have this program because we have all of those other things going on. But this model says, okay, we want to bring in somebody who is an absolute expert, somebody who's early in their career to be what we think of as like a super postdoc, somebody who's 1/3 postdoctoral fellow, 1/3 in-house VC, 1/3 startup founder. And we say, how can they explore some interesting problem space, some intersection like, say, artificial intelligence in healthcare, and sort of journey through and discover every single thing at MIT and every single person at MIT that's interested in that intersection. And then spend 6 months to a year then creating as many project teams, early stage proto ventures, pre-startup levels activities to explore different problems within that intersection. And then over the course of a following year, then stress test all of those ideas so that at the end of it, what you've got is, say, 1 to 4 extremely high quality ventures that have been stress tested, that have teams, that have the ability to immediately launch out of MIT, get VC funding or other kinds of risk funding, and then immediately have high impact in the world. So this is our attempt to shrink the development time of extremely high impact ideas to as little as possible, and do it in such a way that it is creating all of these remarkable positive feedback loops within MIT to connect every single person that's interested in a very high impact problem space at one time. So Proto Ventures will be housed in the IHQ. It will be data driven, and it is a development program then that is attempting to do the most high impact stuff. So this is an example of 3 different layers that are all interacting in one place. Okay, so I finished with the examples. Let me just conclude by reviewing just a little bit. So we've got this innovation infrastructure model. We think about all of these different layers. At MITII, we think about a whole bunch of other layers, right? We think about all sorts of administration as a service. We think about other types of education interventions like hackathons and a minor. We think about other ways that we engage the community. But the point here is that by thinking about these things and all these various layers, we can really understand the how of innovation, right? Understanding the what of innovation doesn't explain the why. And so these innovation infrastructure layers allow us to understand the what, the why, and the how all at the same time. So then I will conclude right where I started off, which is why build innovation infrastructure? Because the how of innovation is problem solving, and innovation infrastructure enables people to solve problems. And with that, I will conclude. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you have any follow-up questions, please be sure to reach out to me at timmiano@mit.edu.
Thanks, Tim. Hey, I have a question.
Sure.
When thinking about Proto Ventures, and this struck me while you were saying it, do you think we could have launched the Proto Ventures program? It's kind of a 2-part question. Without really understanding the infrastructure and all its layers, would it even have been possible? And B, do you think that because of the analysis of all the data and the layers of infrastructure, do you think that speeds, that allows the process to move faster through the pipeline? Like, does it constrict that little tube in the middle to make everything whoosh through faster?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, it is definitely the case that the pre-existing programs allow for something like Proto Ventures to exist, because, and you see this in the evolution of how universities are developing their innovation ecosystems. Mm-hmm. You first have to tackle sort of the low-hanging fruit, things like hackathons, things that just get the student body as engaged as possible, because you have to get a sense of how many people are actually demanding these sorts of activities. Right. And you have to create enough of a culture so that there is a self-sustaining year-over-year turnover of students that are then teaching other students. And then once you have laid down all of those baseline innovation infrastructure activities and interventions and programs, then you can say, okay, now that I have hundreds or thousands of people that are engaged in these things, how can I optimize so that there's some segment that is focusing on high impact stuff?
Right.
Because even our venture builder and all the people on our venture builders team, right? These are people that have spent years at MIT. They have already experienced, they've done hackathons, they've taken classes on innovation or entrepreneurship. Maybe they've tried starting a startup of their own that failed. And you just need those experience layers in place so that you can have very mature people and very mature programs that are able to really focus and tackle hard problems.
Right.
Then to answer your second question, the what's remarkable is programs like Proto Ventures, the act of running them uh, allows more things to happen. So by having a person who's dedicated to a particular intersection like AI and healthcare, their goal is to um, ricochet through the MIT ecosystem, meet all of the people doing that thing or interested in that thing, discover all of the intellectual property or good ideas or sources of funding, and connect all of those people together.
Mm.
So not only does this process enable MIT to then launch ventures that have really high impact, what happens is in the wake of all of those activities,
Yeah.
you get these eddies of even more positive impact because what ends up happening is research labs might have three different choices of how to further develop this technology. But by having a venture builder over here that is actually trying to translate that into commercial markets, let's say, it gives them a guide star to say, we see that there is more potential in one path instead of
Mhm.
another. Uh, and so that creates a feedback loop. Moreover, then you've got all of these other students and researchers that have been interconnected. They share ideas, they've learned from each other, and it allows them to circle back and then create this next generation of people that are furthering that idea.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to say that stuck out to me while you were talking was somewhere in the middle, you mentioned it and it stuck with me throughout is, there are all these layers of of innovation structures within this infrastructure and how they fit together. And for the people within those layers to understand where they are and what they do is really important. But the one thing you said was, is there someone overseeing it? Is there someone looking at it as a whole to figure out how they can or how they are working within and between those layers? And what are the things I, looking at as a whole, can identify to make that process smoother? And I think that there are a lot of places out there that recognize we've got all these programs, we've got all these people, and to look at them as a whole and really think in a structural level the way you do is something that I don't know if other universities are doing, if companies and organizations that, consider themselves innovative do kind of with regularity and consistency. So thank you for doing that, Tim.
You're welcome.